The modern world, it runs on these incredibly complex interlocking systems, right? But maybe the most vital one, arguably, is the one protecting our public health. We're talking about the system ensuring the medicines designed to help us, well, that they're actually safe, continuously. Understanding how that machine works, that really needs a precision deep dive. So today we're drilling down into the specific, pretty highly structured world of pharmacovigilance, or PV, in New Zealand. And welcome to D-Drake Knowledge Capsule. We've really taken apart the regulatory intelligence focusing purely on New Zealand's setup for therapeutic products. It centers around the regulator, MedSafe, and the pretty rigorous demands they place on pharmaceutical sponsors. It feels like a perfect case study, actually, in how a national regulator really enforces that post-market safety.
Exactly. And our mission for you listening in is to walk away with a really crystal clear map of this landscape. We want you to understand who the main players are, what those absolute non-negotiable reporting deadlines look like, and critically, how New Zealand makes sure there's transparency and, continuous oversight once a medicine is actually being used by patients.
Right. Okay, so let's start with the bedrock, the legal foundation. The regulator is MedSafe. And their authority, it stems directly from the Medicines Act 1981. That act is the core legislation. It mandates that sponsors must report significant untoward effects, basically, adverse reactions from their products.
And if the act is the law, then the rule book, the thing sponsors follow day to day, that's the guidelines on the regulation of therapeutic products in New Zealand. Let's just call it GRTPNZ. It's quite a mouthful. Crucially, this huge document has a specific PV guidance section, and it details every obligation really meticulously.
Okay, and here's where it gets really timely. We're not just talking about old laws here. This guideline, the GRTPNZ, was recently updated. Edition 3.0 came out in March 2024. And these new regulations, they took full effect on July 1st, 2024. So we're looking at the exact framework companies are operating under, well, right now.
Yes, and what's quite fascinating there is how quickly sponsors actually had to adapt to those changes. It was a pretty short turnaround. That speed, I think, it really underscores MedSafe's commitment to keeping the system robust and, modern. Plus, New Zealand isn't working in isolation. They participate in the WHO International Drug Monitoring Program. This means the safety net they cast isn't just local. They're actively gathering global post-market safety information through things like spontaneous reporting from other countries and other sources, too.
That global intake sounds incredibly valuable, definitely. But does that ever complicate things? I mean, does international data sometimes clash with what they're seeing locally with New Zealand patients? How does MedSafe handle that potential tension?
That's a great point. And that's where their independent review structure becomes so critical. MedSafe isn't reviewing this mountain of data alone. They rely heavily on an expert advisory body, the Medicines Adverse Reaction Committee, or ARS. ARS is essentially the scientific brain trust. It's made up of external experts, doctors, pharmacists, epidemiologists who analyze these complex safety issues. And they advise MedSafe on actions needed to improve the overall benefit-risk balance of medicines.
So ARS isn't part of MedSafe itself. They're independent.
Exactly. They provide that external, objective, scientific viewpoint. Their role isn't just, rubber stamping things. They dig into emerging safety signals. They look at patterns reported globally and locally. And critically, they provide that solid scientific grounding MedSafe needs to justify taking regulatory action.
Okay, that makes sense. So once RC gives that expert advice, what happens next? What does regulatory action actually look like on the ground? It's one thing to collect data, quite another to enforce safety changes.
Right. The actions MedSafe can take are quite varied, and they scale with the perceived risk. So, armed with MRC's advice, MedSafe might start with wide-scale communications letters to doctors, public notices, or they might demand updates to a medicine's official data sheet, adding new warnings, perhaps. For more serious issues, they can actually suspend the distribution of a medicine. And in the most severe cases, they have the power to completely revoke the consent, meaning the medicine can no longer be supplied in New Zealand at all.
Wow, okay. So that whole process, from Mark's review to MedSafe potentially pulling a drug, it seems really reliant on public trust, doesn't it? How transparent is New Zealand with all this safety data they're collecting?
They've made a pretty strong commitment to transparency, actually. They provide public access to suspected adverse reaction data. It's through the Suspected Medicine Adverse Reaction Search, or SMARS, database. And this database is updated regularly, monthly, in fact. So it gives patients and healthcare professionals ongoing, high-level visibility into what sorts of reactions are being reported.
That sounds like a powerful tool for keeping people informed. But there's a balance there too, right? Transparency is key, but so is protecting individual patient privacy.
Absolutely crucial balance. The source material points out that while SMARS gives you the general aggregated data, sometimes MedSafe does release specific but always anonymized information under the Official Information Act. This way, they meet transparency needs while rigorously protecting the privacy of the individual patients who submitted those reports in the first place. Maintaining that balance is vital for the system's integrity, really.
Okay, that covers the regulator and oversight pretty well. Let's shift focus now. Let's talk about the operational heart, the pharmaceutical sponsors themselves. The day-to-day work of managing safety really falls on their shoulders, doesn't it? What are their core, constant responsibilities under these new guidelines?
Well, first and foremost, they absolutely must maintain a fully functioning pharmacovigilance system. That means being able to collect, collate, analyze, and review all incoming safety information effectively. And for accountability to MedSafe, they have to appoint a dedicated PV contact person based in New Zealand. This person is the single point of contact for MedSafe, making sure communication about safety issues is efficient and, importantly, quick.
Right, that contact person sounds critical, especially when you think about speed. Let's dive into those timelines because they seem really important. What's the absolute baseline requirement for reporting an individual case safety report in ICSR, particularly if it's classified as serious?
Okay, the absolute key, non-negotiable timeline here is 15 calendar days. All serious adverse reactions have to be reported electronically to the New Zealand Pharmacovigilance Services database within 15 days of the sponsor first receiving the minimum information about the case. That timeline is absolutely critical. It's not arbitrary. It aligns New Zealand with major international regulatory standards like those in Europe. It ensures that serious potential risks aren't getting delayed or sort of lost in local processing queues.
15 days. Continuously hitting that deadline, especially if a company has, a lot of products on the market, must be a real logistical challenge for sponsors.
Oh, it's a huge undertaking. It demands very sophisticated internal tracking, validation systems, quality checks, the works. But remember, the ICSR, that's the individual patient story, right? The single adverse event. The system also needs to be proactive, looking for wider issues. And that leads us nicely into the next stage of PV, moving beyond single cases to recognize patterns.
Right. So when do those individual stories start to paint a bigger picture? How does the system identify a potential pattern, a signal? And how quickly does MedSafe expect action once a pattern is recognized? We're talking about signal management here, I suppose.
Yeah.
Which sounds a bit like detective work.
It is, very much so. Signal management is precisely that process, identifying, validating, confirming, or refuting a potential new safety issue, a signal. And it's not just about counting ICSRs. It's about recognizing that, say, 5 seemingly unrelated reports of a specific event, maybe across different patient groups, might actually point to a single, previously unknown risk associated with the medicine. Where do these signals come from? Well, they can pop up from almost anywhere the sponsor gets data. ICSRs, yes, but also large-scale monitoring programs, published scientific papers, maybe even data from the original pre-licensing clinical trials looked at in a new light. And whenever there's a valid indication that something might be wrong, a full investigation has to follow to really quantify and understand that potential risk.
Okay, so they investigate the signal. If it's confirmed, if it becomes a classified safety issue, reporting that to MedSafe then becomes highly time critical. And it's tiered, you said. What are those 2 main categories of the deadlines attached to them?
Yes, there are 2 main categories based purely on severity and urgency. The most critical ones are called important safety issues, or SSIs. If a sponsor confirms an SSI, which represents a potentially serious and urgent risk to public health, they must report this to MedSafe within an extremely tight time frame. 72 hours, that's just 3 working days, from when they internally confirm the issue. That 72-hour clock really highlights the gravity. It's for things MedSafe considers potentially an immediate public health concern.
72 hours, wow. Okay, and for issues that are still important, but maybe not quite that immediately catastrophic.
Those generally fall under the category of other safety issues, or OSIs. Now, these are still significant concerns that need regulatory attention, but they don't demand that immediate 72-hour response. For OSIs, sponsors have up to 30 calendar days to report them to MedSafe. That difference in timing, 3 days versus a whole month, really draws the line between managing critical, urgent risk and more routine, though still important, regulatory safety reporting.
Got it. And to manage these risks ongoing, MedSafe doesn't just wait for these spontaneous reports or signal reports to come in, do they? I understand they request specific, regular monitoring tools for certain medicines, particularly newer ones or those with known risks, to ensure the safety profile stays acceptable over years of use. What are those key tools?
That's right, they have ongoing surveillance tools. The first main one is the Periodic Benefit Risk Evaluation Report, or PBR-ERR. You might know it as a PSUR in other regions. A PBR-ERR is essentially a mandated, comprehensive safety audit. The sponsor has to regularly gather all the safety data worldwide for their product and reevaluate. Does the benefit of this drug still outweigh its risks, given everything we now know? It's an ongoing justification for the product's place on the market, and it might lead to things like dose changes or new warnings if that balance seems to be shifting.
Okay, so that's the look back, the evaluation report. What's the other main tool?
The second key tool is the Risk Management Plan, or RMP. These are more proactive documents. An RMP outlines the known and potential safety concerns for medicine before it even gets widely used, or sometimes after a new risk emerges. And crucially, it details the specific plans and activities the sponsor will undertake to minimize those risks for patients. This could involve things like special educational materials for doctors or patients, or maybe restricting who can prescribe the medicine.
Okay, PBR years for evaluation, RMPs for proactive mitigation. That makes sense. So finally, we get to the point where, as you said earlier, the rubber meets the road. Communication, all this incredibly diligent monitoring, reporting, planning. It only really works if the important safety messages actually reach the people who need them, right? Healthcare professionals, patients, the public, and in a way they can understand and act on.
Absolutely. Timely, accurate, and audience-appropriate communication is just essential. It's non-negotiable. The source material really emphasizes that these communications must be transparent, they must be strictly evidence-based, and crucially, they have to be tailored. You communicate a newly identified serious risk in SSI to a specialist physician very differently than you communicate, say, a new general patient advisory warning to the public through maybe a consumer bulletin or a website update. The language, the channel, the level of detail, it all has to fit the audience.
That makes perfect sense. And what channels does the system typically use to get these safety messages out quickly and effectively?
It seems to be a mix of established and newer methods. They certainly use traditional routes like formal Dear Healthcare Professional letters, often called DHCP letters, also official bulletins from MedSafe, newsletters for health professionals. But increasingly, they also leverage websites and potentially social media where appropriate to ensure the message reaches the widest possible relevant audience, from a highly specialized pharmacist right down to a general consumer looking up their medication.
Okay, putting it all together then. What this really shows us is that for a sponsor operating in New Zealand, sticking to both the national GRTP&Z guidelines and international best practices isn't optional. It's clearly a constant 24/7 commitment to ensuring the safety and the efficacy of medicines across their entire life cycle.
Yes, and what's really fascinating, I think, looking across all this, is that recurring emphasis on collective effort, on collaboration. Upholding these really stringent medication safety standards, it absolutely requires seamless teamwork, not just between MedSafe and the sponsors, who might sometimes be seen as being on opposite sides, but crucially involving the healthcare workers too. The doctors, the nurses, the pharmacists, they're on the front lines actually recognizing and reporting those initial adverse reactions that feed the entire system. That cohesive triangle regulator, industry, healthcare, that's ultimately what protects the public.
That's a great way to frame it. So a quick recap then of the absolute critical takeaways for you listening. New Zealand's PV system, governed by MedSafe, under the authority of the Medicines Act 1981. The key operational rulebook is the GRTPNZ, with the latest update effective July 1st, 2024. Sponsors, you have to remember the crucial deadlines. 15 days reporting serious adverse reactions, ICSRs, and that critical 72-hour or 3-day rule for urgent important safety issues, SSIs. Oversight and expert scientific advice come from the independent MRRC committee, and public transparency is significantly aided by the SMARS database.
Right. And as you think about this highly structured system, particularly those extremely tight deadlines for the most critical issues, we want to leave you with a final thought to maybe mull over. Considering just how vital, clear, tailored, and transparent communication is for effective pharmacovigilance, what potential problems or maybe even unintended consequences could arise in a system like New Zealand's if the different key players, MedSafe, the sponsors, the healthcare workers, start communicating about safety using significantly different priorities or maybe even different metrics for what constitutes urgent or important? It highlights how alignment in communication is just as critical as alignment in regulation, something for you to perhaps think about or explore further on your own.
That's an excellent, thought-provoking place to leave it. If you're hungry for more intelligence on global regulatory requirements, you might want to look into related topics mentioned in our source context. Things like perhaps the comparative challenges of detecting safety signals in smaller markets like New Zealand versus huge global markets. Thanks for diving deep with us today.